Introduction to First and Second Kings. Sovereignty, God's sovereignty, is one of the most difficult things for people of faith to live out in everyday routines. But we have no choice. God is sovereign. God rules. Not only in our personal affairs, but in the cosmos. Not only in our times and places of worship, but in office buildings, political affairs, factories, universities, hospitals. Yes, even behind the scenes in saloons and rock concerts. It's a wild and extravagant notion, to be sure, but nothing in our scriptures is attested to more frequently or emphatically. Yet, not much in our daily experience confirms it. Impersonal forces and arrogant egos compete for the last word in power. Most of us are knocked around much of the time by forces and wills that give no hint of God. Still, generation after generation, men and women of sound mind continue to give sober witness to God's sovereign rule. One of the enduring titles given to Jesus is King. So, how do we manage to live believingly and obediently in and under this revealed sovereignty in a world that is mostly either ignorant or defiant of it? Worship, shaped by an obedient reading of Scripture, is basic. We submit to having our imaginations and behaviors conditioned by the reality of God rather than by what is handed out in school curricula and media reporting. In the course of this worshipful listening, the books of Kings turn out to provide essential data on what we can expect as we live under God's sovereign rule. The story of our ancestors, the Hebrew kings, began in the books of Samuel. This story makes it clear that it was not God's idea that the Hebrews have a king, but since they insisted, he let them have their way. But God never abdicated his sovereignty to any of the Hebrew kings. The idea was that they would represent his sovereignty, not that he would delegate his sovereignty to them. But it never worked very well. After 500 years and something over 40 kings, there was not much to show for it. Even the bright spots, David and Hezekiah and Josiah, were not very bright. Human beings, no matter how well-intentioned or gifted, they don't seem to be able to represent God's rule anywhere close to satisfactory. The books of Kings, in that light, are a relentless exposition of failure. A relentless 500-year documentation proving that the Hebrew demand of God to, quote, have a king was about the worst thing that they could have asked for. But through the centuries, readers of this text have commonly realized something else. In the midst of this incredible mess these kings are making of God's purposes, God continues to work his purposes and uses them in the work. He doesn't discard them. He doesn't detour around them. He uses them. They're part of his sovereign rule, whether they want to be or not, whether they know it or not. God's purposes are worked out in confrontation and revelation, in judgment and salvation. But they are worked out. God's rule is not imposed in the sense that he forces each man and woman in absolute conformity to justice and truth and righteousness. The rule is worked from within, much of the time invisible and unnoticed, but always patiently and resolutely there. The books of Kings provide a premier witness of the sovereignty of God, carried out among some of the most unlikely and uncooperative people who have ever lived. The benefit of reading these books is enormous. To begin with, our understanding and experience of God's sovereignty develops counter to all power-based and piety-based assumptions regarding God's effective rule. We quit spinning our wheels in utopian projects and dreams. Following that, we begin to realize that if God's sovereignty is never canceled out by the so deeply sin-flawed leaders, which are the kings, in both of our culture and our church, then we can quite cheerfully exult in God's sovereignty as it is being exercised, although often silently and hiddenly, in all of the circumstantial details of the actual present. Who is this from? The prophet, or the groups of prophets who wrote 1st to 2nd Kings, knew how grim the actual present could be. He lived in Babylon, exiled from his ravaged homeland. The Babylonians had invaded his country, burned its farmland, and reduced its capital city to ash and debris. From 4 centuries of court records, prophets' journals, and other documents painstakingly salvaged from the wreckage, he pieced together the evidence of God's sovereignty amid his nation's tragedy. Who's this too? Forced from their burning homes to walk hundreds of miles as prisoners of war, the surviving Jews questioned whether God was really sovereign. It looked as though a ruthless king and his army had defeated God, or as though God had abandoned his people. If God is in charge, they wondered, how could this happen? When was this written? About 975 to 586 BC. The books of King detail the ministries of Elijah and Elisha, prophets of the 9th century BC. Neither of them wrote down what they said. However, 16 prophets of the 7th and 6th centuries did write down their oracles in the biblical books that bear their names, Isaiah through Malachi. Of the 16, 1st through 2nd Kings mention Isaiah and Jonah briefly. During this period between around 1100 and 750 BC, the Greeks stopped trading with Egypt in the Middle East and retreated to small farming and fishing settlements. Many citizens of the old Mycenaean cities fled, and new migrants moved in. They built no cities, told stories but wrote nothing down, and made no artwork that survives. Luckily for these Greeks, the empires that plagued Israel left Greece alone to slowly rebuild an urban culture.